Hey folks, this is Sarenth. So this is the third video in my introduction to the Heathen Worldview series of videos. And when I started putting this list together, I asked my patrons, hey, what do you think about this list? And what the resounding answer I got to that list was, you need to put discernment a bit further up. So Malik, this is for you. And for all the other wonderful folks, including Emily and Stephanie, who really kind of pushed me to move discernment back up the list. So what is the point of talking about discernment? So we talk about many gods, many ancestors, and many spirits as beings that we worship in heathenry. How do we have active reciprocity with these beings? Well, this is where discernment comes in. So discernment is how we determine if what we're talking to is actually a god, an ancestor, and a spirit that we're specifically trying to communicate with, or if it's an interloper, or maybe it's our mental projections, images, sock puppets, that kind of thing. So how do we do discernment? Well, my wonderful brother and friend Jim put together this really great tool called spiritual accounting. He has videos on TikTok, and I'm going to put those in the description. But long story short, the way that I like to think of spiritual accounting is that there's three legs in heathenry for him. You've got the lore, which is any writing or archaeology which informs us about ancient heathen culture and the gods, ancestors, and the Vatir. The second leg is people in your community. So these are both experts and peers. These are spiritual specialists, as well as just regular lay people who don't really do anything particularly special, but have experience in the religion over a long period of time. Or just a decent period of time. People that you can talk with and get a sounding board on things. And the third is divination. Now, what this discernment does for us is allows us to look at what the lore has to say about a particular thing, what our peers have to say about a particular thing, and then we get to talk with our holy powers about that particular thing. So if I want to know, I used an example of Freya like strawberries as an example of unverified personal gnosis in the previous videos. So, does Freya like strawberries? Well, we're not going to find anything in the lore. That it's not there. Strawberries weren't found in Scandinavia, they weren't found in Germany, not as we understand them. They're a relatively modern import, right? So we're not going to see anything in the lore, but we can talk to our peers. This is where shared personal gnosis is really important. This is where having people who are living this practice is really important, because they can tell you, hey, so this is what happened when I offered strawberries to Freya. She really dug it. Or this is what happened when I offered strawberries to Freya. She didn't care for that too much. So you can get a lot of different viewpoints on the exact same experience, and they can contradict each other. And that does not necessarily mean that you should or shouldn't do the thing. You got to use your own judgment if you're going to actually sit on that three-legged stool. You park your butt on it, knowing that you've got lore, spiritual community, and divination. So what about divination? How do we do that? Well, divining is going to the gods, ancestors, and spirits and asking for a response. This is communication. Long story short, this isn't finding out your fortune or who likes you or doesn't like you. That's a legit form of divination. Don't get me wrong. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about active communication between yourself and the gods, ancestors, and or spirits. So this can be, in modern heathenry, some folks use tarot cards. A lot of folks use runes. I do. Other folks will do yes-no stones with an indicator stone that falls between them, and where that lands depends on if it's a yes or no answer to your question. You might say flip a coin, or you might flip it so many times, or you might flip 4 coins and heads up means this and heads down means that. There's a lot of different ways that you can engage in divination. Some folks use more interpretive methods where it's not a hard up or down, like with the coins, for instance, or with the stones. They might use a divination method like, say, looking into a candle flame and reporting on the experiences of what they see in the fire after a trance state is induced. So there's a lot of different ways that you can divine and communicate with the gods, ancestors, and spirits. But it's one leg. And just like how the lore and the community involvement in your decision to accept or reject an experience shouldn't be the only thing informing whether or not you do that, divination shouldn't be the only thing informing that either. So, in a case like where does Freya like strawberries and there's nothing in the lore about it, well, do we know that she likes sweet things? Yeah. We know that her name translates to lady, and ladies in Old Norse culture, Old Icelandic culture, had a certain expectation that they would be given the finer things in life. And I'll tell you what, strawberries are damn sweet, and I consider them one of the finer things in life. So you can even work with lore in a more expanded capacity than strictly looking for strawberries in the lore. The point of the three-legged stool is that it's a tool among many. Does this make common sense to you as a person? If you were going to receive this as a gift, would this be a good gift? So, does the strawberry look good? Have you tried another strawberry in the batch? Does it look like it's getting mold? Does it look squished? Don't give lousy gifts, long story short. So, discernment doesn't mean swallow whole every experience you get. It also doesn't mean tear apart the experience while you're in the middle of it. So sometimes folks will come in on one side or the other of this particular spectrum really heavy. They might come in really skeptical and everything has to be steel-manned and every experience has to stand up to scrutiny, or it's wrong, or it's not valid. And then you got folks on the other end of the spectrum, and I'm using these as intentional extremes. You have folks on the other end of the spectrum who are like, oh, I had this experience and it changed my life, and I had another experience and it changed my life. Okay, but have you actually questioned what you experienced yet? Have you asked any questions? Does it actually comport with anything in the lore about what this god does or doesn't do? If you get a really light, gentle, fluffy Odin, I'm gonna give you the side eye. And that's because that ain't in the lore. That certainly isn't noted about his character in any of the written sources. And that's not to say that we should automatically discount experiences that are contrary to the lore or that are contrary to community experience. But we really need to take that under a very heavy, skeptical look, especially if it's missing 2 out of 3. And with 3 out of 3, I would just reject it. So if divination's like, nope, this isn't a thing, if the lore says, nope, this isn't a thing, if the community's like, I don't know what you're talking about, that doesn't sound like blah, in this case, Othin or Freya, then you might really want to consider that the experience you had may have been an experience, but it wasn't of that god. And that going forward, you can look for certain signs or symptoms of, well, this being came to me and said it was Odin, but now I know what to look for. You might find this a very useful tool for weeding out spirits that are trying to bullshit you. So this is where cosmology is really important. So I mentioned the importance of cosmology in the last 2 videos. So if we believe that there are many gods, if we believe that there are many ancestors, and we believe there's many, 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 many spirits, that means that not all of them have our best interests at heart, even if they're gods, even if they're ancestors, even if they're spirits, which means that at least some of them are going to fucking lie. At least some of them have a vested interest in us going one way or the other, and maybe they'll use manipulative tactics to do it. So it's on us to use our brains and to listen to our heart and our instincts about things. And especially when you're relatively new and you're developing these things, this is where especially learning your lore, getting a good source of lore for your practice and your religion and your cultural understanding is really important. Well, it's not going to be a book. It's generally speaking, especially you're talking about heathenry, it's going to be a series of books. TheLongship.net has an amazing resource section. I heavily recommend you folks check it out. Get the books they recommend. I also really heavily recommend Carolyne Larrington's Poetic Edda translation. I also heavily recommend The Beginner's Guide to Heathenry by Matthias Nordvig. It's just come out. It's really good. and it's as a beginner resource, as a one-on-one resource, good stuff. If you want to learn basics on rune reading, Rudiments of Runelore is one that I recommend because it got pointed out to me, and I've been reading runes for about as long as I've been a heathen, so about 13 years, give or take. I would heavily recommend you folks check the book out. Again, thelongship.net has a really good resource, and they even have it thankfully labeled for beginners, intermediates, and advanced folks. So if you're like, hey, I've been a heathen for a little while, but I need to brush up on X, Y, or Z, check that list out. It might have some really good stuff for you. So back to discernment. What discernment does for us is it helps us separate ice cream from bullshit. But it also helps us develop confidence that our experiences are genuine and that we are safely incorporating new information into our understanding, into our lives, and into how we practice our religions. Really important stuff. The danger of too much emphasis on one leg versus the other is something we need to kind of watch out for. But I don't think you're really going to go wrong if you're careful about citing your sources and making sure that, for instance, Freya likes strawberries while it's not in the lore, you at least have a lot of people backing up, hey, this is an accepted practice, this is something she likes. And if you're going to try something new, write it down. See what happens as a result. Do divination on it. Did she like it? Was it genuinely Freya you were talking to? If so, cool. You can present that, and people can accept it or reject it based on their own discernment. And then it may or may not become shared personal gnosis between you and other heathens, you and other entire groups. So this is how we establish modern praxis, modern practice. So we have modern ways of understanding. That is, we have certain ways of definitely understanding the gods. They're ironclad. We have orthodoxy. We don't have a lot of them, but we do have some. And to be a heathen, you need to be a polytheist. You need to worship the gods. Even if it's just one, you at least need to worship one and believe in many. So with that very basic orthodoxy out of the way, what's the orthopraxy? Well, if you believe that there are many gods and they're worthy of worship, you worship. That's the orthopraxy. How do you worship? Well, there are respectful ways to worship. Don't lay garbage down. Don't give a bad offering. What's a bad offering? Rotten offerings to gods that aren't gods of the underworld that are specifically asking for them in things like compost. You'll notice I put a big caveat on there. That's because I have a compost heap that I make offerings to for Hela and Nithog. Oh, also with discernment, you might find that there are certain gods, goddesses, ancestors, and spirits that you want to worship and work with that other heathens might take issue with. That doesn't mean you shouldn't. It means that you should probably be really discerning about what you tell people and about what gods, ancestors, and spirits you choose to worship. It means that you need to do your freaking homework. This is all part and parcel of being a discerning heathen, as opposed to one that just accepts whatever without actually going through the process of saying, hey, does this make any sense at all? It's complicated, but this is very often a very frequent refrain in heathenry. This is the religion with homework, and the homework isn't necessarily cracking the books all the time. The homework is doing the due diligence of talking to your community members, of doing the divination, or getting the divination done, especially if you're too close to a thing. So, discernment is deeply needed. And I say this as a spirit worker, as somebody that does regular engagement with the gods, ancestors, and spirits. I really, really emphasize discernment, both with people that I'm working with and that I'm worshiping with, but also for people that I've never met. Because it's really easy to get taken in by charismatic people or by something that sounds pretty good, but you haven't really done the research on, or you haven't vetted this diviner, but they're saying all the right things. Discernment's really big. And you also need to take a discerning eye to each of the pillars that make up spiritual accounting, because if you're not vetting your resources, you're potentially using faulty, if not false, information to explore whether or not a thing is genuinely an experience or something that you would like to be real, or something that is a sock puppet or an anxiety manifesting itself. Because it's not just necessarily good things that people take as messages from the gods, ancestors, or spirits, like, oh yes, you are great and you are powerful. Sometimes they do the opposite. So if your gods are constantly praising you, that's something to be really thinking about. Is this genuine, or am I just blowing smoke up my own ass? The opposite side of that is constantly being berated or smacked down by your gods, or your ancestors, or your spirits and experiences. And the other thing about discernment is that not everybody takes in spiritual information the same way. You get some people who are absolute bricks, and this doesn't make them bad people, and it doesn't make them bad pagans, it doesn't make them bad heathen. It just means that they're not going to have the same spiritual experiences as you. That's also why you need to talk to a wider range of people than just the people that you seem to agree with or you seem to have the same experiences as. You are going to find people in the heathen community that do not have personal gnosis experiences of the gods at all. And that is their experience of the gods, is that they give their offerings, they make their prayers, and they go about their day. Not everybody gets big, peak, massive spiritual experiences. And that's the other part of discernment. If you're not one of those people, great, fine. That doesn't make you good or bad. If you're somebody that's constantly getting their head blown off by spiritual experiences, that's not good or bad. I mean, it will probably be pretty draining, and it's hard to run a life like that. But you have to be discerning on either side of that spectrum in order to maintain a healthy religious life, so that you're not dipping into superstition, and you're also not ignoring your responsibilities. So I could say so much more on discernment, and I probably will as time goes on, but we're at about 17 and a half minutes, and I think we're going to call it there. Thanks you all for coming on and listening and exploring this with me. So I hope to see you in the next one. Thanks.